The morning sun spilled through the terminal windows as Arthur walked hand in hand with his son toward the boarding gate. Leo, only 7 years old, clutched a small backpack covered in cartoon dinosaurs, his sneakers scuffed from months of use, his jacket a size too big because it had been handed down from cousin. Arthur himself wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans that had faded from years of washing. To anyone watching, they looked like an ordinary father and son heading off on a modest little getaway, perhaps a visit to grandparents or a budget vacation saved for over many months. Nothing about their appearance hinted at who Arthur really was. He had learned long ago that people showed their truest selves when they believed no one important was watching. So today, as he did several times a year, he had left behind the tailored suits, the private car, and the entourage that usually surrounded him, choosing instead to travel as any ordinary passenger would. It was the only way he could see his airline the way his customers saw it. And more importantly, it was one of the rare chances he had to simply be a father to his son without cameras or assistants trailing behind him. Leo tugged at his sleeve as they approached the gate. "Dad, are we really sitting in the front today?" Arthur smiled and crouched slightly to meet his son's eyes. "We are, buddy. Front row seats, just for us. Think you can handle that kind of luxury?" Leo giggled, clearly more excited about the little bag of pretzels he'd been promised than the leather seats waiting for him. When they boarded, the flight attendant greeted them warmly, checking their tickets with a polite nod, not recognizing the man behind the modest clothing. Arthur guided Leo into the window seat, buckling him in gently, then settled into the middle seat beside him. He glanced around the cabin, taking in every small detail: the cleanliness of the aisle, the attentiveness of the crew, the little touches of comfort that had taken years to perfect. This was his work, his life's dedication, disguised now as an ordinary passenger's quiet observation. Leo pulled out his coloring book, humming softly to himself as he flipped through pages of dinosaurs and rockets. For a few peaceful minutes, it was just the two of them, father and son, sharing a rare pocket of normalcy before the rest of the world came rushing in. That peace didn't last long. A heavy, deliberate set of footsteps echoed down the aisle, accompanied by the unmistakable scent of expensive cologne applied a little too liberally. Richard arrived at his row like a man entering a stage, expecting applause. His suit was cut from fabric that shimmered faintly under the cabin lights, and a gold watch gleamed on his wrist, catching the eye of nearly everyone nearby. He carried himself with the practiced arrogance of someone who had spent decades being told he was important, and who had come to believe that importance was owed to him by everyone he encountered. He stopped at his assigned seat, the aisle seat beside Arthur, and looked down at his new neighbors with visible distaste. His eyes swept over Leo's oversized jacket, then Arthur's plain hoodie, then the modest backpack tucked beneath the seat in front of them. A sneer crept across his face, the kind of expression reserved for something he considered beneath his notice. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. He didn't sit. Instead, he turned on his heel and flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a young woman named Claire who had been trained to handle difficult passengers with grace. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice already dripping with condescension. "Is there some kind of mistake here? I paid for first class. I did not pay to sit next to." He gestured vaguely at Arthur and Leo, without even looking at them directly. "Whatever this is." Claire kept her professional smile intact, though her eyes flickered with the faintest trace of discomfort. "Sir, I assure you there's no mistake. Both passengers hold valid first-class tickets." Richard scoffed, loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. "First-class tickets? Look at them. That kid's jacket has a hole in the sleeve. Are we running a charity flight now? Did someone donate seats to the needy today?" A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. A woman across the aisle lowered her magazine, watching with quiet disapproval. An elderly man 2 rows back shook his head slightly, though he said nothing. Leo, sensing the tension in the air, even without understanding the words, shrank a little closer to his father, his crayon pausing mid-stroke on the page. Arthur felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not of anger for himself, but of protectiveness for his son. He had weathered far worse insults in boardrooms and negotiations over the years. A stranger's cruelty on an airplane meant little to his own pride. But watching Leo flinch, watching his son's small shoulders curl inward, was something else entirely. That was the line Arthur would never let anyone cross. He leaned down gently, resting a reassuring hand on Leo's back. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, keeping his voice calm and warm. "Why don't you keep coloring that dinosaur? I think he needs some purple spikes." Leo nodded, though his eyes darted nervously toward Richard, who was still standing in the aisle, blocking boarding for the passengers behind him. Arthur then looked up at Richard, his expression calm but firm, carrying none of the anger the other man seemed to be fishing for. "Sir," Arthur said evenly, "I understand you're upset, but could you please lower your voice? You're frightening my son." Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh, as though the request itself was an insult. "Frightening your son? Do you have any idea who I am? I'm one of the most successful men in this industry. I fly this airline every single week. I have status that people like you couldn't dream of." He gestured dismissively at Arthur's clothing again. "And I am not sitting next to—" He paused, searching for a word cruel enough to satisfy him. "Riffraff for 6 hours." The word landed heavily in the cabin, an ugly ripple spreading through the rows of first class. Claire's polite smile finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. She glanced toward the galley, silently hoping a more senior crew member might intervene before things escalated further. Arthur, for his part, remained remarkably composed. He had built an empire on the principle that character revealed itself most clearly under pressure, and he had learned, painfully, that reacting to cruelty with more cruelty solved nothing. Instead, he simply turned back to Leo, murmuring softly about the dinosaur's new purple spikes, doing everything in his power to shrink the moment down to something manageable for his son. But Richard wasn't finished. Emboldened by the lack of a dramatic reaction, and perhaps a little embarrassed that his outburst hadn't produced the satisfying result he wanted, he turned back to Claire with renewed intensity. "I want them moved. Now, put them in economy where they belong, and give me some peace back here. I don't care what it takes. I fly this route every week, and I refuse to sit next to two people who clearly can't afford to be here on their own merit." Claire took a steadying breath. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I cannot ask a paying passenger to move to accommodate another passenger's preference. Both of these tickets were purchased for first class, and both passengers are entitled to their seats." "Purchased?" Richard repeated, his voice rising another notch. "With what exactly? Coupons? Miles they begged someone else for?" He let out a short, ugly laugh. "Look, I'll make this simple. Give me the flight attendant supervisor. If she won't move them, I want to speak to someone with actual authority on this aircraft." By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of nearly the entire first-class cabin. A businessman near the front lowered his newspaper entirely, watching with open disapproval. A young couple near the galley exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even a few economy passengers, having heard the raised voice from just beyond the curtain, craned their necks to see what the fuss was about. Leo, overwhelmed by the shouting and the tension crackling through the cabin, finally let out a small, frightened whimper, his crayon slipping from his fingers and rolling onto the floor. Arthur immediately bent down, retrieved it, and pressed it back into his son's hand, whispering something quiet and reassuring that only Leo could hear. To anyone watching, it was clear that whatever this man lacked in outward wealth, he possessed an abundance of patience and love for his child, qualities that stood in stark, uncomfortable contrast to the tantrum unfolding beside him. Claire, sensing the situation had moved beyond what she could resolve alone, excused herself and moved quickly toward the front of the cabin, murmuring quietly into her headset. Word was already spreading among the crew that a difficult passenger was creating a disturbance, though none of them yet understood just how significant this particular flight was about to become. Richard, meanwhile, remained standing in the aisle, arms crossed, radiating impatience. He glanced down at his gold watch theatrically, sighing loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "I have a board meeting the moment we land. and I'm stuck dealing with this nonsense. This airline used to have standards. A few passengers exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes at his behavior, others simply staring in stunned silence at the audacity of it all. Arthur said nothing more, choosing instead to focus entirely on Leo, who had finally begun to calm down, distracted by his father's steady presence and the promise of pretzels once the plane was in the air. Minutes passed, though they felt far longer to everyone seated nearby. The boarding process had ground to a near halt, with passengers still filing past Richard's blocked aisle seat, murmuring apologies as they squeezed by. The tension in the cabin had grown thick enough to feel physically an uncomfortable hum beneath the ordinary sounds of overhead bins closing and safety announcements playing in the background. Finally, unable to contain his frustration any longer, Richard raised his voice to its loudest pitch yet, loud enough that it could likely be heard even beyond the curtain separating first class from economy. "I am a billionaire," he announced, his voice booming with wounded pride. "I built half of my fortune through partnerships with companies just like this one. I will have someone's job over this. Give me the captain. Right now. I want this man and his kid removed from this flight immediately. I refuse to fly another minute sitting next to peasants who clearly do not belong in this cabin." The word hung in the air, ugly and absolute. Somewhere behind him, a passenger audibly gasped. Leo, startled by the sheer volume of the outburst, buried his face briefly against his father's arm, his small body trembling. Arthur wrapped a protective arm around his son, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, the only outward sign that Richard's words had affected him at all. A hush fell over the cabin as the cockpit door clicked open. Passengers instinctively turned to look, the air thick with anticipation. Captain Harris emerged, stepping into the aisle with the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect in the skies. His uniform was crisp, his expression stern, his eyes scanning the cabin with the calm precision of a man used to defusing chaos. Richard straightened immediately, a smug, satisfied smile spreading across his face. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. Finally, someone with real authority would set things right, would validate his outrage, would put these people in their proper place. "Captain," Richard began, puffing out his chest, "thank goodness. I need you to remove this man and his son from first class immediately. I am a paying customer of considerable status, and I refuse to be subjected to—" But Captain Harris didn't so much as glance in his direction. Instead, his eyes moved past Richard entirely, landing on Arthur with an expression that shifted instantly from stern authority to warm, unmistakable respect. He straightened his posture even further, snapping into something remarkably close to a formal salute. "Mr. CEO," Captain Harris said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin, "it is truly an honor to have you aboard your own airline today. I hope your flight has been comfortable so far." His gaze flicked briefly, pointedly, toward Richard. "Is this man bothering you and your son, sir?" The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its collective breath, passengers frozen mid-motion, some with hands still raised toward overhead bins, others staring with wide, disbelieving eyes. Richard's smug smile crumbled instantly, replaced by a look of pure, dawning horror. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, no sound emerging. The gold watch on his wrist suddenly seemed far less impressive, his tailored suit far less commanding, as the reality of the situation settled over him like a physical weight. The color drained from his face so quickly that the woman across the aisle actually leaned forward, half expecting him to faint on the spot. "Say," Richard finally managed to whisper, his voice a fraction of its earlier volume. You can't be. He's wearing a hoodie. His kid has a hole in his jacket. There's no way." Arthur, still gently holding Leo close, looked up calmly, his expression carrying none of the vindictive satisfaction that Richard clearly expected. If anything, his eyes carried a quiet, tired sadness, the look of a man who had hoped, however faintly, that this particular flight might have gone differently. I like to travel this way sometimes, Arthur said simply, his voice steady and unhurried. It's the only way to know how my airline really treats the people who fly with us. He glanced down at Leo, who was watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes, his earlier fear fading into confused fascination. And it's the only way I get real time with my son, without everyone treating him differently because of who his father is. Captain Harris nodded firmly, his expression hardening once more as he turned his full attention back to Richard. Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings. You will not be continuing this flight. Richard's composure, so carefully constructed over decades of boardroom dominance, shattered completely. Wait, this is absurd. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? This is discrimination against me. I have rights as a paying customer. I demand. You demanded quite a lot already, sir, Captain Harris interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. You demanded a family be removed from their rightfully purchased seats. You raised your voice loud enough to frighten a child. And you referred to 2 passengers, one of whom happens to own this airline, as peasants and riffraff, in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. He gestured toward the rear of the plane, where 2 uniformed security personnel had already begun making their way up the aisle, alerted by the crew the moment the situation had escalated beyond ordinary complaints. That is more than sufficient grounds for removal, regardless of who you claim to be. Arthur gently squeezed Leo's shoulder, offering his son a small, reassuring smile before looking back up at the captain. He's been nothing but a disruption to this flight and to my family since the moment he arrived, Arthur said quietly, without malice, simply stating the truth as it stood. I'd like him removed so we can get on with our trip in peace. The security personnel arrived at Richard's row, their expressions professionally neutral despite the drama that had just unfolded. Richard opened his mouth once more, perhaps to argue, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to salvage some shred of dignity from the wreckage of the last 10 minutes, but no words came. Instead, he simply stood frozen, his earlier bravado utterly evaporated, replaced by the stunned realization that his own arrogance had cost him more than he could have imagined. As the security team began escorting him toward the exit, gathering his expensive leather briefcase and folded coat along the way, a slow ripple of applause began somewhere near the middle of the cabin. It started with a single passenger, the businessman who had lowered his newspaper earlier, clapping firmly with an expression of deep satisfaction. Within seconds, the applause spread, passenger after passenger joining in, some standing slightly from their seats, others simply clapping where they sat, all of them united in the same quiet sense of justice finally served. Richard's face burned crimson as he was led down the aisle, past dozens of eyes that had witnessed his humiliation from beginning to end. He didn't look back. He didn't say another word. The doors of the aircraft closed behind him moments later, the ordinary hum of pre-flight preparations resuming as though the entire incident had simply been a passing storm now cleared from the sky. Arthur exhaled slowly, the tension finally leaving his shoulders as he turned his attention fully back to his son. Leo looked up at him, his earlier fear entirely forgotten, replaced by open-mouthed wonder. "Dad," he whispered, "was that man really trying to get us kicked off the plane?" Arthur chuckled softly, brushing a stray curl from his son's forehead. "He was, buddy, but it didn't work out too well for him, did it?" Leo giggled, the sound bright and unburdened, a welcome contrast to the whimper that had escaped him just minutes earlier. "Are you really the boss of this whole airline?" "I am," Arthur admitted, his voice warm with affection. "But right now, I'm just your dad, and we've got a vacation to get to. So how about we finish coloring that dinosaur before takeoff?" Leo nodded eagerly, retrieving his crayon and settling back into his seat with renewed enthusiasm. Around them, the cabin gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though many passengers continued to steal admiring glances toward the quiet, unassuming man who had just been revealed as one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry. A man who, even after being cruelly insulted in front of dozens of strangers, had responded not with anger or retaliation, but with calm, steady protection of his child. Claire approached moments later, her earlier professional composure now tinged with genuine warmth. "Mr. CEO, I want to personally apologize for what happened. If there's anything at all we can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable." Arthur held up a gentle hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You did nothing wrong, Claire. You handled that situation exactly the way you were trained to, with patience and professionalism, even when it clearly wasn't easy. I'll be sure that's reflected in your file." He glanced toward Leo, who was now humming contentedly over his coloring book. "Honestly, you gave me exactly what I needed to see today. Proof that my crew treats every passenger with respect, no matter how they're dressed, and proof that they won't bow to pressure just because someone flashes money around." Claire's eyes softened, a small, grateful smile crossing her face. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." As the aircraft finally began its taxi toward the runway, Captain Harris's voice crackled warmly over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and offering a brief, professional acknowledgement of the earlier disturbance, assuring everyone that the flight would now proceed smoothly and comfortably for the remainder of the journey. A few passengers chuckled quietly at the understatement, exchanging knowing glances with their neighbors. Arthur settled back into his seat, watching through the window as the ground fell away beneath them, the world shrinking into a patchwork of fields and rooftops below. Leo leaned against his shoulder, already growing sleepy despite his earlier excitement, his coloring book resting forgotten in his lap. "Dad," Leo murmured drowsily, "that man was really mean." "He was," Arthur agreed softly, wrapping an arm around his son. "But you know what, buddy? The way people treat others when they think no one important is watching, that tells you everything you need to know about who they really are." Leo nodded sleepily, his eyes drifting closed as the gentle hum of the engines lulled him towards sleep. Arthur watched him for a long moment, a quiet, contented smile settling over his features. Whatever chaos had unfolded in the past half hour, whatever ugliness Richard had displayed for the entire cabin to witness, none of it mattered now. What mattered was this: his son, safe and warm beside him, drifting peacefully towards sleep, utterly unaware of just how much his father's quiet strength had shielded him from the worst of the world today. Below them, thousands of feet down, Richard stood in the terminal, still reeling from the humiliation of his removal, already dreading the headlines that would inevitably follow once word of the incident spread. His assistant would later inform him, with poorly concealed satisfaction, that video footage from several passengers had already begun circulating online, capturing his tantrum in humiliating detail, his cruel words about peasants and riffraff replayed endlessly across social media, his own company stock taking a modest but noticeable dip as news of his behavior reached investors and business partners alike. But high above, none of that mattered yet. Somewhere over the clouds, a father and son sat together in quiet comfort, sharing a rare, unguarded moment of peace, undisturbed by wealth, status, or the cruelty of strangers. It was, Arthur thought as he watched his son sleep, exactly the kind of moment that no amount of money could ever buy, and exactly the kind of moment that reminded him why he had built his airline in the first place. Not for luxury, not for status, but for the simple, powerful idea that every passenger, regardless of how they looked or what they wore, deserved to be treated with dignity. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the gentle murmur of conversation resumed throughout first class. The earlier tension now in nothing more than a story passengers would tell their friends for years to come. Somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a woman quietly typed out a message to her sister, describing the incredible scene she had just witnessed, unable to stop smiling as she recounted every satisfying detail. And beside the window, a small boy slept peacefully, dreaming of dinosaurs and purple crayons, entirely unaware that he had just witnessed his father deliver one of the most powerful lessons imaginable. That true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in moments of conflict, and that real power lies not in demanding respect, but in quietly, consistently earning it. Hours later, as the plane began its slow descent toward their destination, Leo stirred against his father's shoulder, blinking sleepily at the golden light spilling through the window. The earlier chaos of the flight felt like a distant memory now, softened by the long, peaceful hours that had followed. Arthur had spent much of the journey simply being present with his son, playing quiet games, answering endless questions about clouds and altitude, and listening to Leo's excited theories about what their vacation might hold. "Dad," Leo asked, rubbing his eyes, "do you think that man learned his lesson?" Arthur considered the question carefully before answering, choosing his words the way he always did when speaking to his son about difficult things. "I hope so, buddy. Sometimes people need something to shake them awake before they realize how they've been treating others. Whether he actually learns from it, though, that's up to him." "I don't think I want to be that mean," Leo said thoughtfully, staring out at the clouds drifting past the window. "You never will be," Arthur said, squeezing his son's hand gently, "because you already understand something that took that man his whole life to forget, if he ever knew it at all. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it's worth more than any amount of money." As the wheels touched down and the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, many of them still buzzing quietly about the extraordinary scene they had witnessed earlier. Several approached Arthur as they disembarked, offering quiet words of admiration for how he had handled the situation, for the grace he had shown even while being publicly humiliated, and for the obvious love he clearly had for his son. One older woman paused beside his seat, resting a gentle hand on his arm. "I've flown 100 times," she said, "and I've never seen anything quite like that. You should be proud of yourself, and prouder still of that little boy. He's lucky to have a father like you." Arthur thanked her warmly, genuinely touched by the sentiment, before gathering Leo's backpack and guiding his son up the aisle toward the exit. As they stepped off the plane and into the bright terminal beyond, Leo looked up at his father with the simple, unclouded joy that only children seem to possess. "Dad, this is going to be the best vacation ever," he declared, practically bouncing with excitement. Arthur smiled down at him, feeling a warmth in his chest that no boardroom victory or business triumph had ever quite matched. "I think you might be right, buddy," he said, taking his son's hand as they walked together into the terminal, leaving behind the drama of the flight and stepping forward into the simple, precious ordinariness of a father and son beginning their journey together, exactly as Arthur had always hoped it would be. Somewhere behind them, back at the departure gate, word of the incident continued to spread among airline staff, whispered from one crew member to another with equal parts astonishment and admiration. It would become something of a legend within the company in the months that followed, a story told to new hires as an example of exactly the kind of culture the airline strived to protect. One where every passenger, no matter how they arrived or how they were dressed, deserved to be treated with the same fundamental respect and dignity, and where the man ultimately responsible for that culture never stopped checking, quietly and personally, to make sure it was being upheld.